The morning started with Karen Whitfield's prize-winning petunias getting showered in sewage when her brand-new deluxe jacuzzi erupted like a volcanic geyser, spraying brownish water 30 feet into the air and coating half the pristine Willowbrook Estates community in what could only be described as liquid nightmare. "Wait delay hill is happening," screamed her neighbor Janet, frantically hosing off her white Mercedes as chunks of mysterious debris pelted her windshield. Karen stood frozen in her silk robe, watching $15,000 worth of luxury spa equipment transform into a sewage fountain, while her phone buzzed incessantly with angry calls from the HOA board. The jacuzzi, her secret weapon in the ongoing war to prove she was the most successful resident in Willowbrook, had somehow connected to the wrong pipes. Instead of circulating pristine heated water, it had been drawing directly from the community's main sewage line for 3 weeks. "Ma'am, you need to shut off your water main immediately," shouted the emergency plumber who'd arrived within minutes, his face pale as he surveyed the destruction. "This isn't just a plumbing error. This is an environmental disaster." But Karen's mind wasn't on environmental disasters. It was on the fact that she'd been hosting her weekly Wine and Wellness Wednesday gatherings in that jacuzzi for 3 weeks, entertaining the wives of city councilmen, the bank president's daughter, and worst of all, her nemesis from the HOA board, Margaret Chen. 27 of Willowbrook's most influential women had been soaking in sewage while sipping champagne and discussing their charitable endeavors. "This cannot get out," Karen muttered, grabbing the plumber's arm with desperate strength. "You didn't see anything. I'll pay you double, triple, whatever it takes." The plumber shook his head, pointing at the growing crowd of neighbors, documenting everything with their phones. "Lady, half the neighborhood is covered in sewage. The health department's already been called. There's no covering this up." Karen's perfectly manicured world began crumbling as she realized the implications. She was HOA President Karen Whitfield, the woman who'd issued 200-plus violations in her 2-year reign, the terror who'd forced the Johnsons to repaint their house 3 times because their chosen beige was too aggressive. She'd built her reputation on perfection, control, and superiority. Now she was the woman whose illegal jacuzzi had created a sewage tsunami. Her phone rang, Margaret Chen's name flashing on the screen. Karen's hand trembled as she realized that in exactly 4 hours, she had an emergency HOA meeting where she'd have to face every resident she'd tormented, every family she'd fined, every neighbor she'd cited for violations, and they'd all know that their perfect, untouchable HOA president had been bathing in sewage. The explosion had done more than destroy her backyard. It had shattered the carefully constructed facade that made Karen Whitfield the most feared woman in Willowbrook Estates. 4 hours later, Karen sat at the head of the HOA conference table, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled despite 3 outfit changes and enough concealer to hide a crime scene. The community center had never been more packed, with residents spilling into the hallway, all buzzing with barely contained excitement about witnessing their tyrannical HOA president's downfall. "Let's address the elephant in the room," announced Margaret Chen, Karen's longtime rival, barely suppressing a smirk. Or shall I say, the septic tank in the jacuzzi. The room erupted in laughter. Karen felt her face burn as she watched neighbors she'd terrorized with violation notices now openly mocking her. Mrs. Patterson, whom Karen had fined $500 for a decorative gnome, was literally pointing and giggling with her husband. The installation was completed by licensed contractors. Karen began defensively, her voice higher than usual. "Any connection errors are clearly their responsibility, not mine." Licensed contractors. Margaret shuffled through a stack of papers dramatically, because according to the permit office, no permits were ever filed for your jacuzzi installation, which means this was all done illegally, in violation of County Code 47B and our own community standards. Karen's throat tightened. She'd deliberately skipped the permit process to avoid the months of HOA approvals, thinking her position would protect her. Now that shortcut was becoming her noose. Furthermore, Margaret continued, clearly relishing every moment, "I've received calls from the health department. 27 residents were potentially exposed to harmful bacteria and parasites. The county is launching a full investigation, and several people are already showing symptoms of gastrointestinal illness. "You're talking about my friends," Karen snapped, her composure finally cracking. "These women trust me. I would never intentionally." "Trust," interrupted Dave Morrison, whose lawn Karen had declared aggressively overgrown last month. "Like we trusted you when you tripled our HOA fees to pay for your personal landscaping projects?" The accusations started flying from every corner. Years of pent-up resentment exploded as residents stood up one after another, detailing Karen's abuses of power. The $300 fine for a slightly crooked mailbox, the demand to remove children's chalk art from driveways, the mysterious emergency assessments that always coincided with Karen's home improvement projects. Karen felt the room spinning as she realized how thoroughly she'd isolated herself. Every relationship was transactional. Every friendship was built on fear or social climbing. She'd spent 2 years building an empire of control, never realizing she was actually constructing her own prison. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence," Margaret announced. "All in favor of removing Karen Whitfield as HOA president?" Hands shot up across the room, dozens of them. Karen watched in horror as even the women from her Wine and Wellness Wednesday group raised their hands, their faces showing a mixture of betrayal and disgust. "The motion passes unanimously," Margaret declared with obvious satisfaction. "Karen Whitfield is hereby removed from all HOA positions, effective immediately." But as Karen gathered her papers with shaking hands, Margaret wasn't finished. "Oh, and Karen? The board voted to pursue full legal action for the sewage incident. You'll be hearing from our attorneys." Karen stumbled out of the meeting into the parking lot, her reign of terror officially over. But as she reached her car, she noticed something that made her blood run cold: a black sedan with county license plates parked nearby, and 2 people in suits taking photographs of her house. Her Jacuzzi nightmare was just beginning. 3 days after her public humiliation, Karen discovered that losing her HOA presidency was the least of her problems when Environmental Protection Agency investigators knocked on her door at 7 a.m., armed with search warrants and soil testing equipment. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm Agent Sarah Martinez with the EPA," announced the stern woman holding official documents. "We're here to investigate potential groundwater contamination resulting from your unpermitted sewage discharge." Karen's coffee mug slipped from her hands, shattering on her marble foyer floor. Groundwater contamination. It was just a plumbing mistake. A plumbing mistake that pumped raw sewage into your neighborhood for 3 weeks. Agent Martinez replied coldly. "We've detected elevated bacteria levels in 4 surrounding properties. This is now a federal environmental crime investigation." Through her window, Karen watched in horror as EPA teams in hazmat suits began drilling core samples from her prize-winning garden. Her neighbors gathered at property lines, some taking photos, others just enjoying the spectacle of Karen's perfect world being literally torn apart. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters, lawyers, and former friends wanting statements. The story had gone viral on neighborhood social media groups. HOA Hitler's sewage spa scandal. Someone had leaked photos from the Wine and Wellness Wednesday gatherings, now circulating with captions like, "Guess what they were really soaking in?" "Karen, we need to talk," came a familiar voice from her doorway. It was her husband, David, whom she'd barely seen since the explosion. He worked in corporate finance downtown and had been handling crisis management for 3 days. "The company's legal team says I need to distance myself from this situation," he continued, not quite meeting her eyes. "They're worried about liability issues affecting my position." Karen stared at him, realizing she was seeing her husband clearly for the first time in years. "You're abandoning me." "I'm protecting our assets," David replied mechanically. "The house, the accounts, everything needs to be transferred out of your name before the lawsuits hit. It's just good business." "Good business?" Karen's voice cracked. "David, I'm your wife. We've been married 15 years. And you've been acting like a dictator for 2 of them," he snapped back. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this has been? My colleagues are calling me Sewage Steve behind my back." The bank president asked me how I didn't know my wife was bathing clients in shit water. As David stormed out to handle paperwork, Karen sank onto her designer couch, surrounded by the luxury items she'd accumulated to prove her success. For the first time, she wondered if her relentless need for control had cost her everything that actually mattered. But her self-reflection was interrupted by a knock at the door. Through the peephole, she saw Margaret Chen holding a manila envelope, flanked by 2 other HOA board members. "We thought you should see this in person," Margaret said, handing over the envelope with obvious satisfaction. The county health department's preliminary report. Karen's hands shook as she read the findings. 7 people hospitalized with severe bacterial infections. Groundwater contamination extending to 12 properties. Estimated cleanup costs, $2.3 million. And at the bottom, in bold letters, criminal referral recommended for willful environmental endangerment. "The district attorney is reviewing the case," Margaret added. "But don't worry, Karen. I'm sure your cell will be much easier to keep clean than that jacuzzi." As Margaret and her companions walked away, Karen noticed something that made her stomach drop even further. Parked across the street was a familiar black sedan, and the same 2 investigators from before were now photographing everyone who entered or left her property. This wasn't just about HOA politics anymore. This was about potential federal crimes, and Karen was beginning to realize that her real problems were just getting started. 2 weeks later, Karen sat in criminal defense attorney Rebecca Walsh's office, watching her net worth evaporate with each billable hour, while learning that her situation was far worse than she'd imagined. The EPA found sewage contamination in the groundwater, extending nearly half a mile from your property, Walsh explained, sliding a thick report across the mahogany table. "We're looking at potential federal charges under the Clean Water Act, which carries up to 3 years in prison and fines up to $50,000 per day of violation." Karen's hands trembled as she calculated the math. 21 days of sewage circulation times $50,000 equaled over $1 million in potential fines alone. "But I didn't know. The contractors made the error." The prosecution argues that bypassing the permit process shows criminal intent to avoid oversight. Walsh continued grimly. "And there's more. The health department confirmed that 12 people contracted serious bacterial infections from exposure to your jacuzzi. 3 are still hospitalized." The office door opened, revealing Walsh's paralegal with an urgent expression. "Mrs. Walsh, the district attorney's office called. They're filing criminal charges this afternoon. Mrs. Whitfield needs to surrender herself for booking by 5 p.m. Karen felt the room spinning. In her ruthless pursuit of HOA perfection, she'd somehow become an actual criminal. "What about bail?" "Given the environmental damage and flight risk assessment, I'd estimate $250,000, Walsh replied. "Plus you'll need to surrender your passport." As Karen left the law office, she drove through Willowbrook Estates one last time. Yellow EPA tape still surrounded her property, and she noticed several for sale signs had appeared. Neighbors fleeing the contamination zone she'd created. The community she'd ruled with an iron fist was literally being destroyed by her actions. Her phone buzzed with a text from David's attorney. "Divorce papers filed. Asset protection measures activated. Do not contact client directly." Standing in front of her house, Karen realized she'd lost everything: her marriage, her reputation, her freedom, and ironically, the perfect community she'd tried so desperately to control. The woman who'd spent 2 years issuing violations for crooked mailboxes was now facing federal environmental crimes. But as she prepared to pack for jail, Karen noticed something odd. Margaret Chen was standing in her own driveway, talking intensely with the same EPA investigators who'd been documenting Karen's case. From this distance, their conversation looked remarkably friendly, almost conspiratorial. Margaret caught Karen watching and smiled, not the triumphant smirk Karen expected, but something colder, more calculated. Something that suggested Margaret knew more about the sewage connection than she'd admitted. Karen's attorney had told her to prepare for 3 years in federal prison, but as she watched Margaret's mysterious conversation with the investigators, a new question formed in her mind. What if the Jacuzzi connection wasn't an accident after all? As the sun set over the contaminated community she'd once ruled, Karen Whitfield realized that her fight was far from over. Someone had orchestrated her downfall with surgical precision, and she was going to find out who, even if she had to do it from behind bars. The HOA war was about to become something much more dangerous, and Karen was no longer sure who the real enemy was.